Welcome to On Becoming a Healer, where we take a respectful but also a critical look at our profession and how we bring new doctors into the profession. I'm Stefan Kertes with co-host Saul Wiener, and as I'll introduce in a moment, a special guest. Now, hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
I'd like to set up this episode for just a moment. People who've listened to the most recent episode know that we turned our attention to mistreatment of medical students. Our last episode looked at what is mistreatment and some model efforts to address it. Today, we're staying on that theme. We're going to approach mistreatment with a somewhat different question. We're speaking today about mistreatment of medical students as a contributor to burnout, both in the short term and the long term. And crucially, we have a special guest. Hello, Dr. Lottie Derby.
Hi, nice to be here with you today.
Dr. Derby is Senior Associate Dean of Faculty and Chief Wellbeing Officer for the University of Colorado School of Medicine. This position includes a very broad ambit, much related to her expertise, includes faculty and leadership development programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and crucially for this episode, efforts to reduce burnout among physicians, residents, and medical students. In fact, Lottie wrote in Academic Medicine in 2020 that 44 to 55% of medical students have burnout symptoms and that educators have a collective responsibility to address the factors contributing to it. Previously, she was at Mayo Clinic, where she pursued considerable work related to student and faculty development. She's also co-author of the National Academy of Medicine's consensus report, Taking Action Against Clinician Burnout, a Systems Approach to Professional Well-Being. I'm hoping Saul can introduce a few things about why we're approaching this subject in this way.
Thank you, Stefan. In preparing for this episode, I was reading some of Lottie's work, and one of the themes that came out that I just think is important to highlight here is the degree to which medical students are affected adversely during the early years of their medical training. Students arrive in medical school remarkably healthy and resilient compared to their college peers who are going into other careers. And then something happens fairly quickly. And within a relatively short time, we see signs of burnout and depression that now fall below their age-matched peers. And this, of course, should be of major concern to all of us. And it's also in some ways not only sad, but deeply ironic. Medical school should be a period where people are, if anything, celebrating the success that got them there. Becoming a physician is an inherently meaningful work. There are fascinating new things to learn. It involves caring and connection with people at a time of need. Quite honestly, there are other privileges as well. Physicians are well paid. People in medical school know that. There's going to be remarkably high job security, low unemployment. The position still has status. And yet, despite all that, we seem to be doing a significant amount of damage. And I think part of our aim today is to explore this with somebody who has thought about it a lot. So thank you, Lottie, for being here with us.
Yeah, it's really my pleasure, Saul. And you bring up, I think, a really good, important point. And that is, despite going through a really rigorous college education and, application process and all those pieces that go into matriculating in medical school, that when we've looked across multiple medical schools at matriculation, medical students' mental health and their level of burnout is really better than their age-matched peers. So, both looking at burnout, looking at depression, but also looking at the other end of the spectrum. So when we measured quality of life using really validated instruments, we saw it that at matriculation, students really had really high levels of quality of life, much better than other peer-matched, similarly aged college graduates. So we are starting off with the right substrate. But then, as you pointed out, what happens once they're under our collective wing, we start to see that divergence. We start to see that they have more depression, that they have more burnout, that they have worse quality of life across multiple domains relative to other U.S. college graduates.
And I wonder if at this point I can verify my understanding of what the definition of burnout is, just to check this out with you. Emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, a loss of sense of professional efficacy. I think I pulled that out of a paper. Do you think that captures what burnout is?
Yeah, so that, Stefan, is really consistent also with the World Health Organization of burnout. So when we look at it in physicians, it's mostly related to that emotional exhaustion. Like, I have nothing left to give. My tank is empty. I can't emotionally give anything else. And then it's often also that depersonalization or that cynicism, that negativism. that you don't care what happens to your patients is kind of a common example. So we see those two constructs more than we see the sort of loss of personal accomplishment. I think for the most part, people in medicine recognize that they're accomplishing something, they're caring for others. So it's more really those other two domains of burnout, the depersonalization and the emotional exhaustion that we see as the major constructs that are relevant to healthcare workers and medical students.
Now, we're going to talk about how these emerge in the years of medical school, but by way of mistreatment as a potential contributor, among others. And that brings us to a paper that you wrote with a team, published in 2021 in JAMA Network Open. We're not going to be doing a journal club on it, but I want to give people a general sense of what it was about and ask some questions. And essentially, you looked at whether mistreatment experiences, as reported on a national standard survey in years 1 and 2 of medical schools, affected the report or experience of burnout by year 4. And this involved many thousands of respondents, very relatively recent data. The first main finding that stood out to me was that 23% of students at the end of year 2 described having experienced mistreatment. And I think there's a wide range of behaviors that could fall under that designation, from unwanted sexual advances to discrimination to humiliation. And I certainly wanted to make sure that I shared with you, like, what do you think are key things to think about when understanding what is mistreatment, just to get us on the common page?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder in many ways, Stefan. So there's not great uniformity around sort of what is and what isn't mistreatment when you look at these questions. But in the eyes of the students, they're being asked about, having been belittled or humiliated. People made comments about them that reflected sexism or racism or, these sorts of negative constructs. It's rare that it's a form of violence, fortunately, toward a student in terms of mistreatment. It is really mostly communication. It's verbal. And when we've looked at mistreatment in medical students, we've looked at it in residents, we've looked at it in faculty, it is mostly related to communication. So things people are saying about you or about your performance that isn't fair, or that's negative, or that's really grounded in a bias.
The likelihood, I would think, is that over years 3 and 4, somewhat more people would experience or report mistreatment. I don't know. I mean, I've seen estimates of 30 to 70% would affirm that by year 4. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it always sort of depends on how people ask the question too. Like, have you ever been mistreated? The older you are, the more opportunity you've obviously had for those sorts of negative interpersonal experiences. We've also seen that there's a lot of mistreatment that happens by patients, families, and visitors. So as the students are getting out into the clinical setting, they're experiencing mistreatment from other individuals beyond sort of the 4 walls of the medical school. So we definitely have that on our radar screen. I think that's something that we all need to really think about. It's certainly happening to our faculty. It's happening to our residents. It's happening to our students.
And with students, the big sort of statistical work that you did in your paper was to try to do that analysis of whether a person's experience of mistreatment by the end of year 2 really did predict statistically burnout in year 4. It seemed to me that it did, and that it was independent of several other characteristics that were controlled for, that we'd hope would be controlled for. I wonder if there's anything about that basic statistical finding that you think people need to pay attention to.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter sort of your walk of life. It doesn't matter your gender or your race or in our work beyond medical students, like your specialty. Having these experiences of mistreatment are independent predictors of burnout a couple years later. And that's really the main finding in the paper. The other point was, not only does it sort of increase your risk of burnout, but when students are mistreated, they're also much more likely to have career regret. And, we hate to have our matriculating students there at graduation not so sure they want to be a doctor anymore because of the experiences that they've had during that really important acculturation process, during that process of identity formation, during that process of becoming a doctor. How sad is that, right? To have given up so much and being so dedicated and devoted, and then you stand there at graduation and you're like, I'm not sure I really want to do this.
And to put some numbers on it, roughly 6% of those who had not reported any mistreatment at year 2 expressed career regret at year 4, whereas those who had experienced it more than once, it was roughly double, close to 12%. So that's a pretty large increase based on having had that experience. I know that it sounds intuitive, but is there something deeper there? I guess I'll put it this way. There are lots of stories that we see in the movies where people are being told you're never going to make it, you can't do well, you're looked down on, and people triumph over adversity, and they do great. So one could argue, getting some bumps in the road is just part of building character, and the triumph over that is part of the human experience. What's the big deal? Is that consonant with how you're looking at this problem? I suspect not, but I want to hear what you think.
Yeah, so we know that burnout is caused by unmitigated chronic stress. So the basic model is when your job stress or your job demands are higher than your resources, your job-related resources, when that balance comes out of sync, people are more likely to develop burnout. So we think about what are sort of the job demands, right? Or what are the causes of job stress for a medical student? And a lot of it obviously is around interpersonal interactions, that they are having and when they go awry, like when mistreatment happens. When mistreatment happens, that is a source of job stress. And although we can try to put a lot of resources around them, like building social support and camaraderie and being effective educators and these other pieces, if they're having a lot of these negative interpersonal experiences, those are going to cause job stress, and that's going to tip the balance, and that's going to head them toward burnout, which then has important consequences. Once you have burnout, you're more likely to continue to have burnout, which then can negatively impact patient care, quality, safety, things that we really care about, cost of care. And it can also impact, as I mentioned before, career satisfaction. And when we have unsatisfied docs, we have worse patient care, we have loss of productivity. So it starts this snowball.
One of the things that struck me looking at the AAMC survey, and for those who are not familiar, the data that we're talking about mostly comes from a survey that is administered to medical school students at the end of their second year and at the end of their fourth year. And on the one hand, it's a remarkably detailed survey. It asks medical students about 16 different types of behaviors, negative behaviors that they can experience, ranging from obviously one extreme end being physically harmed to being subject to unwanted sexual advances to, on the other hand, just having to deal with individuals who don't respect their time, send them on errands to get lunch for them rather than having them present on rounds and so forth. So the point is it asks about a lot of discrete behaviors, which is extremely valuable. But I'm also struck by what it doesn't ask. And these are things that are much harder to capture in a survey, which is the extent to which the environment itself feels psychologically safe, the extent to which medical students may be experiencing infantilization, in other words, not being treated respectfully in a whole number of ways, the extent to which the curriculum itself can drag you down. One of the things I experienced as a medical student, and I'm learning disabled, is that I just found the curriculum itself to be abusive. I remember I was constantly being told to memorize incredible amounts of stuff that I couldn't retain, or if I did retain, I forgot it the next day. I wasn't sure why I was being asked to learn it. The biochemistry professor would throw stuff at me, and the physiology professor would throw stuff at me. And then by the time I got to my third year, I discovered that a lot of what I had to learn actually wasn't very useful, and a lot of what I needed to know I was never taught. And I spent all of my waking hours chronically stressed trying to jump through all these hoops. And I think that this is stuff that isn't really captured on the AAMC survey, but is just part of the soup in which medical students are living. And in some ways, I almost feel like the stuff they're asking is almost the straw that broke the camel's back. It's not as if our medical students are walking into this environment that's highly respectful and well customized, and that they just have these occasional unfortunate incidents that somehow drive them over the edge. And I think the narrative that you were throwing at us, Stefan, which is sort of the one in the movies, is that, somebody overcomes adversity. They're subject to physical or unwanted sexual abuse or any number of things, and they sort of triumph over it. And I think what we're seeing, in fact, in medical school is almost like that's being piled on top of everything else. And I think that's what's really hard to capture in the analysis that we do when we study medical student mistreatment based on the kind of survey data that's available to us. Even though it's useful, it seems like it's missing something. And I'm really interested in bringing that into the discussion.
Yeah, I think, Sally, you bring up a really important point. Mistreatment is one of the many sources of stress for students. If all mistreatment went away, we would still have some students who are experiencing burnout and other forms of distress. And one piece that you were just talking about is the learner workload. There's been these studies where they estimated how long it would take a person without a learning disability to complete all the reading assignments. And that, we're assigning medical students more reading assignments. There's any way any human could complete. So like having a manageable workload is a piece of it. And there's other pieces as well. For example, just related to supervision, related to things that don't hit mistreatment, but just aren't great teaching. Like not taking time to give students feedback is a piece of it. Not sort of creating that positive, inclusive learning environment. So there's so many pieces of it, as well as social support and isolation. So these really big medical schools who don't have a learning community or who spread their students in clinical rotations all over a state or multiple states, that's a huge stressor for the students as well. So, one paper never has all the factors in it. And this one paper we're talking about today, looks at that mistreatment, but, we have 20 years of publications that look at other aspects of the student experience. And one of the original papers I did also looked at personal life events. We think about burnout is caused by work-related stress. We talked about that, but there's sort of this reality that you have a coping reserve and you can take a lot of work-related stress. And then you kind of get to a tipping point, and sometimes what gets you to that tipping point are also things that are happening in your life outside of work. So when students have really negative personal life events, that it can also be a contributing factor.
When I come on the wards at the beginning of a month, I usually say, it's really important to me that you feel comfortable, you feel supported, that you feel respected as you do your work here to the students and the residents. And that things that can get in the way of that always matter to me, and I want to help. So I say something like that. I would be nervous about people thinking they had to tell me something personal. But have you thought about that, or whether that's a conversation we should be open to, a show we're open to?
I think the more we can build connections with our learners, sort of the more they're going to feel supported. And also the more we role model taking care of ourselves and also being, leaning into change and talking about that, talking about our experiences and our journeys with the students is really helpful. So we need to do all the right things in terms of, graded autonomy and feedback and helping to teach them navigate end of life conversations and conflicts with family members. And there's all these pieces we need to do. And, we need to role model. We need to be willing to build connections and show some vulnerability to our learners. I bet if you just think back on your own experience, what do you remember from residency? What do you remember as a medical student? I remember being invited into my pulmonary critical care attending's home. I remember what his kitchen looks like. I remember the chili that he served. I don't really remember anything else about my critical care rotation, but I remember him caring about me as a person. And that went such a long way. And that's how I think about my experience.
I think that's such an important point that I want to kind of build on it. I think you talk about the importance of connection, and the question is, what kind of connection? And one of the things that I've often felt when I'm with medical students and residents is that they're junior colleagues. And what I mean by that is, I have more experience as a physician than they do, and I've taken care of more patients. And as the attending, I have the final word. But quite honestly, there are lots of things they're better at than me. There are many things that they have insight on that are relevant to patient care that I may not have insight on. And so in a fundamental way, I think I relate to them on a level playing field with the understanding that, I have a legal responsibility to make the final call. And obviously, as a supervisor, I may have to make decisions that influence the grade that a medical student gets. But fundamentally, we're both intelligent people working together. And I'm sort of interested in talking a little bit about the model of the nature of the relationship, because the hierarchical model has been deeply embedded in the culture of medicine for generations. And it's often been quite patriarchal and quite stern, and I think often contributes to a disconnection. And so I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about the nature of the connection that you think is most beneficial to preventing burnout and fostering enthusiasm among learners for the profession that they've joined.
Well, Saul, I think you highlighted already a couple of really important points. And one is sort of being willing to be vulnerable in the moment. And we know now more than ever that we can't have all the information in our head. We have to be willing to sort of say in the moment, I'm not sure what the right thing is to do. Let's go to the computer. Let's go to Medline. Let's go to UpToDate. like role modeling that behavior, that there are limits to your knowledge, and also sometimes deferring to the resident, like, I wonder what Dr. So-and-so thinks. And having that collaborative spirit, I think, is really important. So being willing to be vulnerable. And another piece is creating a sense of belonging. So our learners, fortunately, are becoming more and more diverse. And that means they're not all called Mary, Sam, Steve. and like learning their name and how to pronounce it is such an important piece. And being willing to say, what was it again? How do I say your name again? I'm so sorry. But just being willing. I mean, it's so important that our learners are called by their preferred name, which may or may not be the name on their name tag, and their preferred pronoun, and also to be willing to, I think, importantly, share a piece of you. People are incredibly curious. How do you be a doctor? How do you be a doctor and have kids and have a dog and take care of your parents? And being willing to have those stories or show them, this is how I live. This is my mess in my kitchen. This is my life. I think those are important things. It's not only role modeling the professional piece. This is how I dress. This is how I talk to patients. This is how I carry myself when I interact with nurses or have a conflict with a pharmacist. But this is how I conduct my life at home. And I think being willing to show that to our young learners is a really important piece of the acculturation process. And I think it also gives them hope that, I don't have to have the perfect kitchen, and I can have a misbehaved dog, and I can have a dent in my car. And I think it also helps to lower our psychological size. And that is also a piece around creating that psychological safety that you mentioned there, Saul.
Yeah, that's what I heard here, is that showing the vulnerability, including admitting mistakes, acknowledging where we're not sure, is what contributes to a sense that the other person can tell us, you know what, I'm not getting done what I'd hoped to be getting done. I need help, or I wasn't treated the way I wished to be treated, and I need some help on that. But all those conversations only begin if you're operating as an equal and if they see that you are kind of vulnerable and open to that. It seems right, huh?
Yeah, I think another piece that I've discovered in the last few years is our need to stand up in the moment for our learners. I'm thinking about a setting where a patient or a family member says something that's clearly biased. And the first time that happened to me, I was so busy picking my jaw off the floor, I failed the learner. I didn't support them in the moment. I didn't say the right thing. And I learned a lot from that in terms of learning the words to say in the moment, going through that training, understanding stereotype threat, understanding the rules and the responsibilities and the right thing to do in the moment. I think sometimes we as doctors get, patient, I got to keep the patient happy. But really, we have to keep the learner in a positive work and learning environment. We deserve that. That's aligned with our values, but it's not something that we necessarily learned how to do in medical school or residency. And that's an important piece, I think, of our own development.
I wonder how we break what might be called a dysfunctional cycle in our profession, because I think one of the things that happens is that when medical students are treated in ways that are disrespectful, when their sense of well-being is eroded, when a chronic anxiety is not addressed, when connections are not formed, it has long-term consequences for the kind of residents they become and ultimately the kind of attendings they become. And sometimes the kind of leaders they become. I mean, physicians rise into very high ranks within their communities, whether it's in the private setting or in academic medicine. And then they're likely to perpetuate the culture because of the experiences in which they've grown up. They may not have learned to model positive behavior. They may be insecure. They may be unhappy or angry. They may feel a need to throw their sense of power around. The list goes on. And then, of course, that ends up recreating the dysfunction. And so it's interesting that when we think about how mistreatment affects residents and attendings, we also realize that it's the cycle that creates the culture in which all of us live. So I'm curious, you're a leader in the well-being space for a large academic medical center. And I'm curious about how you think about that and what the approach is. And I know that there's both effort to eliminate the negative behaviors and also efforts to promote the positive behaviors. And in some ways, it might be even a little harder to define and promote those than it is to try to prevent the negative behaviors. But it's more than just preventing the negative behaviors. It's more than just trying to tick off the list of things on the AAMC survey and say, we can't have that here. But it's also trying to promote the positive. And I'm curious about how you think about that, given this tremendous cycle that affects all of us.
That's a really great point, Sal. So some of it is having good systems in place to deal with suboptimal faculty relations, like when communication goes awry or somebody's temper gets the best of them, or they say an inappropriate thing to another member of the team, like to have a system where that can be appropriately dealt with, whether that's sort of director of faculty relations, or in some institutions, it's a center of professionalism of some sort. And those conversations can be, these coffee cup conversations around what's going on, more reflective, formative conversations to help kind of reach and guide that individual to kind of all the way up the scale to a punitive measure. But the other end of the spectrum is probably more important. Before people are so-called reported to the principal's office for bad behavior, how can you help that professional identity formation from the very beginning to all stages of training and career and beyond? And some of that is in onboarding and talking about the culture and the values and how we display those values. There's sort of a variety of different tactics that can be embedded within grand rounds and other ways to try to promote, that positive, inclusive culture. I think the other big piece of it, frankly, is our leaders. So whether that's program directors or division chiefs or department chairs, behave relates to the well-being of the individuals underneath them. So this is true in nursing. This is true for physicians. This is true for residents and fellows. How we perceive our immediate supervisor is a big independent predictor of our burnout, as well as our level of satisfaction with the organization. So a long-winded answer, to improve the culture means having 360 evaluations of our leaders, coupling that with effective leadership development to help them improve, teaching them compassionate leadership skills, teaching them participatory leadership skills to really be able to advance a positive culture.
Academic medical centers have competing missions, and a lot of major medical centers have a high priority on say, research dollars and rankings and so forth. And the people who rise up into the top positions are often people who are selected because they prioritize the research mission, for instance. And even though a name medical school has the word school in it, that word can get forgotten. And we can see a tremendous emphasis, regardless of what's said, on recruiting faculty who are big-time researchers and who are promoted based on their ability to do that. And so the culture around well-being and the health of medical students can get relegated to, well, let's have them do some modules. And rather than, a genuine commitment to making that the core of the culture. If you see what I'm saying. And I think Stefan's laughing because I think we're on the same page here. So, all three of us have lived in this world for years. So I'm just curious, as a well-being officer, how you tackle that.
Yeah, well, we're certainly not going to online our way out of this either. And it does take leadership commitment from the top. And there are leaders across, the United States, across our academic medical campus who get it, that the well-being of the workforce is mission critical. You're not going to get high quality, safe, cost-effective care to patients. You're not going to get top quality research. You're not going to be able to recruit or retain top diverse talent if you don't pay attention, more than lip service, if you don't pay attention and really try to move the needle on factors that are impacting the work lives of our doctors, of our nurses, of our pharmacists, all the members of the care team, certainly of our residents and of our students. Big reason medical school, why do academic medical centers have medical schools in the first place? Part of it is because the faculty they recruit want to teach and want to be involved in medical school. Part of it is it's the pipeline to get faculty. And we sort of need more of this top box score for medical students to say, yes, if I was to offer a residency position, or if I was to be offered a faculty position, this is the place that I would want to stay at. And I think that needs to be a metric sort of on the scorecard of deans and other leaders to sort of know, okay, I'm doing my very best to create an optimal environment for diverse top talent, because that's mission critical.
Saul, you kind of alluded to this, but it does relate back to Lottie's paper. The paper ostensibly says, look, mistreatment in year 2, burnout year 4. And burnout year 4 might mean burnout later. But I also begin to hear this other echo, which is that the amount of burnout that the mistreatment at year 2 or year 3 contributes to in the one person is only part of the story. The other part of it is who then rises up to become the leader of the system. And if they've somehow accommodated the idea that everyone's a little abused and everyone's a little burnt out, and we just tolerate a little mistreatment all around, they actually change the job descriptions of the people around them forever. So there's this indirect pathway by which the mistreatment and the burnout issues that arise early in training don't just mean that Stefan or an individual person is at risk, but rather our bosses are at risk of discounting something that actually is going to matter in terms of our survivability as clinicians. Is that plausible to you, Lottie, that the indirect pathway may be quite important here?
And again, just to pick up on this, Stefan, when you and I were preparing for this episode yesterday, I remember you're calculating, I think we talked about the sort of R squared, which is if you look at the research on burnout, to what extent does prior mistreatment as a medical student contribute to burnout? And I think somewhere you came up that it only contributes to about, you made it up.
5,
you said
10%.
5-10%. It's a relatively small factor. And I don't recall where you pulled that from, but you were looking at some of the data. And I think your point is that while medical student mistreatment contributes to burnout, it's a relatively small piece if you want to be hard-nosed about it. But it's probably a huge factor in its overall downstream effect on the culture of medicine. And I think that's what you're asking. Is that fair?
Yeah, if my dean or my boss or my director basically has been taught to say, buck up, we've got to do this, then they absorb some cultural lesson in medical school, and now they're my boss, and I'm at risk. That's my concern.
Well, I think we've certainly heard that dialogue. When you think about when we went to work hour restrictions, like all of us went through a residency program before there were any kind of work hour restrictions on the books at all. And so when those work hour restrictions started to get rolled out, we were all like, the weaker generation, or like, we did it. They should have to do it. And I think we all now acknowledge that for patient safety, for quality, let alone for the well-being of the residents, work hour restrictions are a good thing and the right thing. And there's never been a generation that hasn't talked negatively about a younger generation. That's just sort of society, and that's kind of the way we are as humans. And I agree with your point, Stefan, that when we have leaders who have had these sort of adverse medical student, residency training events, they carry this baggage with them. And that also impacts sort of their experience and the lens they look at things through and their behaviors. I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this piece of how much does mistreatment contribute to burnout, because we know that it varies a lot by the outward appearance of an individual. So an individual from a minoritized group is going to have many more of these mistreatment experiences. The more mistreatment experiences you have, the higher your risk of burnout. We've shown that in medical students. We've shown that in residents. We've shown that in physicians in practice. So we are very worried about diverse talent choosing not to work in academic medicine. We need diverse top talent to work in academic medicine to deliver top quality of care to advance the science. So if we're serious about those missions, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to the experience of our minoritized colleagues, because it's a big contributing factor. It might be a 5-10% contributing factor to us, but I can tell you it is a much bigger contributing factor to people from traditionally minority groups within medicine.
And this came up earlier in the conversation. First of all, point well taken. But this point came up earlier when you talked about your jaw dropping to the floor when you heard something said, on rounds that was dismissive or degrading. I don't know if it was racial or ethnic, but I've also been in that exact situation. And I have to admit, I was like, oh my God, what do I do? And I was confused because I knew I had to confront, but at the same time, I wasn't sure how to avoid chastising a patient. And luckily, we didn't address it in the second, but the third-year resident had a little plan. It was a patient who had referred to a doctor in a denigrating way who was not in the room, but we all heard it. And the resident reported back in the afternoon. They'd gone back to the patient. It was in the middle of a clinical dispute, and the resident had addressed the clinical concerns that were driving the patient to a stressed place, and then said, we need to have a shared understanding of how we refer to each other here in this environment. So we're respectful of each other, and we don't want you to refer to someone the way that you did. And the patient apparently teared up and said, oh gosh, I feel terrible about it. And actually was a very therapeutic conversation. But more important for this conversation was not what it did to the patient, but that when this was reported back to all of us on rounds, we understood that we had a third-year resident who stuck up for the culture of the team.
Really, really important. And we need more of that, right? And I think that's why, we try to do bystander training, upstander training, and hopefully not through an online required module, but through a meaningful session with our colleagues and I think that kind of gets back to how do we pragmatically upskill ourselves to do the right thing in the moment, to promote a positive learning environment, to be able to stand up to bias appropriately in the right way, consistent with our values. And as my other hat is in faculty development, and the last thing my faculty need is one more, nights and weekends and noontime session that they're too busy to go to. So really pushing ourselves to think about how can we pragmatically help upskill each other, whether that's a short podcast or that's a video you can watch while you're walking to your car, or if that means, instead of having one more CME session on cellulitis or management of COVID, we're going to take this existing faculty meeting to help you learn these skills. We can't do any more add-ons. We need to do more instead of, to help our faculty develop the competencies that they need to do what they want to do, which is the right thing in the moment to support each other and our learners.
I love that, add-ons versus instead ofs, because life is about making choices. That's how we express our values. Add-ons often don't express the value because no choice has been made, or one that's very passive. Saul, do you have a last question or two before we come to a close?
Yeah, I think that the message that I take from this conversation is that the AAMC questions are really a starting point. When we're trying to understand medical student mistreatment, of course, we have to start by looking at how do we identify and prevent the kind of negative behaviors that medical students experience and that are elicited on the questionnaire. But conversation has to expand beyond that. And we have to be thinking about the culture itself and the way in which we are often unaware that we have become indoctrinated by that culture and maybe functioning in ways as leaders and as faculty and as residents that are in subtle ways wearing people down, degrading their sense of well-being. I'm thinking, for instance, of I'm on my school's medical student professionalism committee. And, we're often asked to help remediate students where there have been issues around professionalism. And I'm often struck by how quickly we forget to ask the student what they would find most helpful. We're often directive and saying, well, this is what you need to do, rather than saying to ourselves, this is an individual who is imperfect just as I'm imperfect, and who makes mistakes just as I make mistakes, and who knows themselves better than any of us know them. And why can't we just have a conversation with them and help them provide insight in what's going to help them grow as individuals? And it so often doesn't occur to us to do that. And I think it's that creates an environment for our learners that often feels oppressive, where they often feel like they're not being respected. Maybe they can't even put their thumb on it, but there's something about being in this world as a medical student, someone at the bottom of the totem pole, that doesn't feel good. And we're doing it to them, and we don't even know we're doing it to them. And I think the big challenge for us is to be able to look afresh at the community that we've created. And of course, as a wellness officer, that's kind of your core role in a way. And I'd love to get your final thoughts on how we look at ourselves afresh and try to make our culture better.
I think it's sort of like, how do we give good feedback? We first ask the learner, how do you think it went? What would you have done differently? Tell me more about that. And if we approach these professionalism lapses in the same way, I think we would probably get further towards that sort of community building and that sort of participatory approach, and also building capacity for reflective practice. What we found in our research of residents and physicians, so further down, the road, is professionalism lapses, suboptimal behaviors happen more often in the docs who are burnt out. So thinking about, where is the student on that spectrum of a burnout, or are there other underlying mental health issues that have contributed to that display of suboptimal behavior? I think it's a really important piece of it. And just a related comment is we need to stop othering. And this is something that we all do, and we are sort of creating a culture with it. It's not my fault that I'm burnt out. It's my chair's fault. It's the hospital fault. My values aren't aligned. It's the dean's fault. It's Medicare's fault. It's Epic's fault. We love to complain about Epic, or another EHR vendor. We are so busy othering that we forget it's a shared responsibility. There's a piece each one of us can do to reduce the risk of burnout in ourselves and in our colleagues. There's a piece each one of us can do to promote a better culture, to help a medical student in their identity formation. to help a resident, to help a colleague. And I think identifying what's in your sphere of influence to do today and do just one little incremental thing. If we all just did that, it would be a better culture, a better place for us to work, a better place for our learners to thrive.
I am so thankful that you said that. Thank you so much, Lottie, for coming on this episode of On Becoming a Healer.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Take care, everyone.